So the final section of this module is going to focus on the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was really big. I'm not going to take anything away from it. Stretched all the way up into Scotland, down to northern Africa, and into the Near East. But as large as it is, I like to be able to give some perspective here, and let's look at this on a world map. Everything that we've discussed up to this point is contained within this particular area right here. This is the Near East. There's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There's Egypt. This is the Aegean Sea, so everything Greek was right in here. This is the city of Rome, and the empire itself is, again, just this area right in here. There were cultures developing all over the world. There were people developing artwork, expressing themselves in a number of different ways all over the world. It's just that the perspective that we've taken up to this point is a Western perspective, which is sort of channeled through a Greek and Roman development. Later in the semester, we'll begin to look at how these different cultures were developing in other areas. But for right now, I think it's just important to know that everything that we've looked at is right here, very tiny pocket of the world. Now, Roman culture is different from a lot of the cultures that we've looked at up to this point because there wasn't a lot that was specific to the Romans. They really, I call them an all-star culture. They would just take the best of everything that was around them and they would mush it together and call it Roman. They were bumping up against and invading all sorts of other different people who had different clothing, different means of expression, different languages, and these things would just sort of melt into what would eventually become, sorry, Roman culture. Because of that, you see a lot of influence from areas that were around the Italian peninsula at the time. You're going to see a lot of Greek influence, and you're going to see a lot of Etruscan influence. Now, the Etruscans were the people who just happened to live in the Italian peninsula in this particular area before the Roman Empire was established. They believe that the Romans were actually a different group of people that came down from Europe and sort of forced the Etruscans out. But when they got there, they found these temples. Now, the Etruscan temple doesn't look completely different from a Greek temple. It still has columns and an entablature on top, and it still has decorative sculpture, but the floor plan here is very different than the floor plan that you might have paid attention to when we were talking about the Greeks, particularly the Parthenon. The Parthenon was maybe 15 or 20% cella, and remember that cella is that utilitarian space, it's the main room. And the Parthenon was particularly special because it had an altar on the inside and not on the outside. Most Greek temples really were supposed to be appreciated from the outside only. The Greek temples, it took a long time to build them because it required skilled masons to carve the stone. It required skilled people to place the stone. It required people to quarry the stone and to transport them. So it's a very time-consuming process. It was expensive, and they really didn't want people just going around and just messing up their nice buildings. The Etruscans felt completely different about it. This is about 50% cella, even though it's divided into three separate rooms, probably for men, women, and a priest class. It's 50% cella and 50% portico. A portico is just a fancy word for a porch. It's a word that gets used today, but it's still just, it's a portico is a porch. So this is going to come back into play a little bit later. As is this. This is actually, this relates back to the Greeks too. Remember when we were talking about the crater, the funerary vessel, and that continuous obligation to have to fill that thing full of wine over and over and over again? Well, one thing that gets overlooked a lot here is that on top of this sarcophagus, which is supposed to house not one, but in this case, probably two bodies, on top of the sarcophagus are two reclining figures who are holding their hands really weird. Now, the reason their hands are so weird is because originally he would have been holding a goblet here. She would have had a small vase with for flowers, and in this hand should have been placed a piece of fruit. The flowers are going to rot, the fruit's going to rot, and that wine, I guess, is going to evaporate. There's that same continuous obligation for your family members to have to keep showing up, week after week after week to make sure that you are being tended to, even though you might have been gone for, decades at this point. We human beings have this, it's a big part of the ancient world is just refusing to be forgotten. Part of human nature is just avoiding being irrelevant. There's a term or a phrase, everybody dies twice. The first time when they stop breathing, and the second time, the final time anyone ever mentions their name. Which one of those is scarier to you? I think in the ancient world they just sort of accepted that the first death was just inevitable, but the second one was something they could fight against, and this is a way of doing it. The Greeks just had a slightly different way of going about it, but it's a part of the ancient world. It's part of who we are as people, and I feel like it's a really interesting thing. Let's just move on. Uh, Julius Caesar deserves his own class. He's a huge figure in history. And this word here, denarius, a denarius is just it's the type of coin that this is. It's a unit of currency. Um, what I think is most important here is the way that Julius Caesar chooses to depict himself on this denarius. I just think whenever coins are exchanged, it's when goods or services are being exchanged. He wants you to see his face every time that your life is becoming better, because he wants you to be reminded that he's the reason that that's happening. Now, Julius Caesar, by this point in time, had already been a conquering general. He had already been this strong physical presence. But by the time that he was a leader, a Caesar, he wanted to be known for something other than that. He wanted people to know that he was someone who was thoughtful and someone who was wise, and that wisdom is supposed to have come with age. Now, he never got old enough to look as weary and worn as he does on this particular coin. And I'm almost positive that was a stylistic choice. He wanted to be seen as someone who is older because there's a wisdom that's associated with that age. And this is part of something that's called verism or verism, depending on how loyal you want to be to the Latin. But that verism is paying homage to someone by capturing their likeness as accurately as possible. It's like just being true to them. Aulus Metellus here is was a real person. He was a senator. He was an orator. He was someone who was known to be a very charismatic speaker. And the face of civilization has been shaped by charismatic speakers. The Romans recognized the power in that. It's almost like a superpower. Essentially, by making a sculpture that looks exactly like Aulus Metellus, they're saying that they don't want to live in a world that doesn't have at least some piece of Aulus Metellus. They want this sculpture to exist so that generation after generation after generation of people can see Aulus Metellus and know the significance that he had as a figure. Beyond that, if you can compare this to Greek sculpture, and it's important that you understand that there's the one primary difference that I see between Greek sculpture and Roman sculpture, at least most Greek sculpture, is that the Greeks were for the most part pursuing idealism. They were all about godlike perfections, and they didn't really care about individuals. And that's true up until the Hellenistic period. So we're just going to pretend that's a different thing. The Greeks were about perfection. The Romans were about individuals. So I'm thinking the connection that's being made there is that they're also saying that Aulus Metellus was so godlike already. He was so perfect that nothing needed to be changed. By capturing him as lifelike as possible, they're saying that he in reality is already godlike. It's a pretty big statement. It's true not just for Aulus Metellus. We'll backtrack to this, but it's true of any any patrician. A patrician was an upper class citizen of Roman society. There were basically two classes. There were the patricians and there were the plebs or plebeians. The plebs were basically just working class. The patricians were very, very proud of being patricians, and they were very, very proud of their lineage. There's this term that I like a lot. It's called consanguinity, and it comes up a lot when discussing Roman culture, because they legitimately believe that the blood that they have pumping through their bodies is blood that they received from their fathers, who received that blood from their fathers. And if there was something that was great about your grandfather, your great great grandfather, it doesn't matter how far back it goes. If you share that blood with them, then you share that greatness. If they were a great general, then you have the potential to be a great general. If they were a really brave and courageous warrior, then you have the potential to be a brave and courageous warrior. So holding on to this belief that you are connected to all the preceding generations. It goes back to the funerary vessel. It goes back to the sarcophagus that we were looking at, which you're still attached to all these people that preceded you. Now, it looks here almost like this man is carrying two dismembered heads. He's not. These are just portrait busts of his ancestors, probably we'll say his father and grandfather. This would actually have been fairly common in a patrician household to find portrait busts and sculptures kind of like this. Wouldn't have been unusual for a family to gather once or twice a week in what was a trophy room, where someone in the family would pick one of the busts of their ancestors and talk about how this particular figure, how they died and how courageous they were, and about how smart and great they were, and about how you as their descendant are also part of this great lineage of people. And it was a big part of who they were as Romans. They honestly believed that just because they were Roman, because they shared this blood, they were better than everybody else. And that's because this blood goes all the way back to Romulus, the founder, at least the theoretical founder of the Roman Empire. It's kind of a long story. I won't go through the whole thing, but Romulus was basically a superhuman figure, nursed as a baby by a she-wolf and made to be superhuman. And Romans believed that if you were a patrician, then you could trace your bloodline all the way back to Romulus, this superhuman figure. If you were a pleb, however, it was illegal for you to have a portrait bust of yourself made. These portrait busts usually came from death masks. When a patrician would die, they would have somebody come in and actually put plaster over their face, so you would have this very accurate likeness to make these really nice detailed portrait busts out of. They would also make masks that they would hire actors to walk around at these really big events. If there was a remarkable, like a special birthday or a wedding or something, they might hire actors to walk around wearing the face of your great 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 grandfather or something, just so there's this reminder that you're part of this great big thing. It's just you share this bloodline, and it's if it's a special event, you want your whole entire family to be there, even if they've been dead for hundreds of years. It was just part of who they were as Romans. So let's move on. Now, we talked about the difference between Roman and Greek sculpture. Let's talk about the difference between Roman and Greek architecture. Now, this building looks very Greek, and that's not an accident. The Romans loved Greek architecture. But if you look at the floor plan here, that looks Etruscan. The Etruscans had, even though this is one big cella instead of three separate ones, it's got a portico and it's got a cella, and you don't waste a lot of space. If you even look right here, these columns are what's called engaged columns, which means that they're actually just half columns attached to a load-bearing wall because it takes up too much space. You're wasting space if you use real columns. That means you have to shrink the cella down. So they took the aesthetics of the Greeks, mixed it with the actual utilitarian space of the Etruscans, and that's how you develop Roman architecture. Like specifically, these are, for those of you paying attention, these are Ionic columns. But these temples are found all over Rome. Romans love building temples. You can go to Rome today, and every 3 or 4 blocks, you'll probably find a really impressive temple somewhere. Um, they weren't on top of the hills. They were put where people would actually be using them. And the fact that they're laid out in a way that they're made of mostly utilitarian space indicated that the Romans wanted people using these spaces. Or the Greeks, when you look back at maybe the blueprint of the Parthenon, where it does have a cella, but the cella is maybe 15 or 20% of the overall footprint of the building. And that was even special because it had an altar inside. Most Greek temples, it mentions this in the videos, most Greek temples had altars on the outside of the building. They wanted the buildings to be appreciated from the exterior. They're supposed to be this imposing presence that sits in an acropolis, towering up over everything else. The Romans, they just wanted to put these things where people could use them. Uh, the reason that they were so free with building temples is because they had concrete. It was really expensive and really time consuming to build a Greek temple, but concrete is really easy. Not only is it easy, it's really malleable, and you don't have to have a lot of skilled labor to work with it. So they built the structures everywhere. It's completely revolutionized the way that architecture developed in the Roman Empire, because if you were a patrician, odds are you could have a decent house that might look very similar to this